She saw a cat in her photo, but what she found out changed everything. What if the cat in her old photograph wasn't just a ghostly echo of a beloved lost pet, but the key to a shocking secret that would unravel an incredible journey of survival against all odds? The truth of how Jasper, her long-lost Maine Coon, navigated miles and years to reappear is more astonishing than Emma could ever have imagined. Don't miss this emotional roller coaster. Subscribe, like, and listen to the full story to discover what she found out that changed everything. The stale air of her cramped Chicago apartment felt heavy, each tick of the wall clock amplifying the silence of 2 a.m. Emma, a freelance architectural photographer whose passion had dwindled to a paycheck, was engaged in her ritualistic avoidance of sleep trawling through terabytes of old forgotten digital files. Tonight, it was a folder cryptically labeled West Coast Drift, Unsorted. 22. 3 years ago, a lifetime. Most were stark landscapes, forgotten assignments, moments she'd captured but never truly seen. She clicked on IMG 7834 RAW, a wide, melancholic shot of what looked like Oregonian coastal dunes, seagrass blurred by wind, the Pacific, a distant brooding gray. She'd almost dismissed it, her finger hovering over the delete key. Another gigabyte of digital dust when an anomaly in the midground snagged her vision. A pinprick of white, almost camouflaged against the pale, dry stalks. Professional habit and ingrained attention to detail made her drag a selection box and zoom. Once, twice, the pixels swam, then sharpened with brutal clarity. Her breath caught a sharp, painful intake that burned her lungs. It was a cat small, mostly white, hunkered low as if bracing against the coastal wind. And then the world tilted, a perfectly circular splash of cafe au lait brown covered its left eye like a miniature monocle. Another, a distinct, almost deliberate smudge adorned its right hind leg just above the paw. Her trembling hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that threatened to become a sob. The room spun, the keyboard felt miles away, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It couldn't be. It was a phantom, a cruel trick of light and longing, a digital ghost conjured from grief. But the markings were too precise, too achingly familiar. They were Jasper's markings. Jasper, her beloved Maine Coon mix, who had vanished 3 years prior, swallowed by the chaos of a multi-car pileup on I-80. During a cross-country move from New York to a new hopeful life in Seattle that never quite materialized after his loss. Jasper, who she'd mourned, searched for with frantic, tear-soaked flyers at every truck stop for 100 miles, and finally agonizingly accepted as lost forever. Yet there he was, or his impossible double, staring out from a forgotten photograph taken hundreds of miles from where he disappeared in a place she had no distinct memory of even being with that level of photographic focus. Her finger, numb and clumsy, jabbed at the zoom again, pushing the image to its grainy limits. The cat in the photo was undeniably real, its posture alert, its gaze fixed on something beyond the frame. But she hadn't seen a cat that day. She would have remembered, wouldn't she? A cold dread, sharp and sickening, pierced through the shock. What did this mean? Was she losing her mind? Or had something far stranger, far more unsettling, just clawed its way into her reality? The abruptness of the realization left her gasping, the implicit question screaming, in the sudden, oppressive silence of her apartment. The 3 years since Jasper's disappearance had been a study in muted grays for Emma. The vibrant, adventurous spirit that had once defined her, that had led her to embrace the uncertainties of freelance photography, had been carefully packed away, much like Jasper's favorite toys, now hidden in a box at the back of her closet. She lived in a small, functional apartment in Chicago, a city chosen more for its job prospects in architectural photography than for any love of its urban sprawl. Work was a necessary distraction, the clean lines and predictable angles of buildings, a stark contrast to the messy, unpredictable nature of life of loss. Her photographs were technically proficient, earning her a steady if unexciting income. But the soul, the spark that had once made her images sing, was missing. She rarely touched her personal camera anymore, the one she'd used to capture candid moments, street scenes, and most frequently, the myriad expressions of Jasper. The accident on I-80 was a recurring nightmare, a kaleidoscope of screeching tires, shattering glass, and the sickening lurch of impact. In the chaotic aftermath, as rain slicked the asphalt and emergency lights pulsed an eerie rhythm, Jasper's carrier, somehow broken open, was empty. She'd searched for hours, then days, her voice raw from calling his name, her clothes torn from scrambling through roadside ditches and thorny underbrush. The highway patrol had been sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. Animals rarely survived such incidents. They'd said the vast, indifferent plains of Nebraska had swallowed him whole. The move to Seattle was abandoned. The city, once a beacon of a fresh start, now seemed tainted by the prelude to her deepest sorrow. She drifted, eventually landing in Chicago, the geographical and emotional midway point between her past and a future she no longer knew how to navigate. Her West Coast drift trip, taken about 6 months after losing Jasper, had been an attempt to outrun the grief. It was a blur of solitary drives down winding coastal highways, cheap motels, and countless photographs taken on autopilot. She'd been chasing something, peace, oblivion, a sign, but found only a deeper sense of her own isolation. Thousands of images filled her memory cards, most unexamined, like unread letters from a forgotten self. She hadn't specifically remembered being on those Oregon dunes, not with the clarity the photo now demanded. Perhaps it was a fleeting stop, a brief moment of aiming her lens, before moving on, the presence of a small, distant cat, too insignificant to register consciously against the backdrop of her pervasive sadness. Her life now was one of rigid routine, early mornings at the gym, long hours hunched over her editing software, solitary meals. She had few close friends. Sarah, a college roommate who lived in Denver, was her main confidant, their weekly calls a lifeline. But even Sarah couldn't fully comprehend the Jasper-shaped hole in Emma's life. To others, he was just a cat. To Emma, he had been family, a furry, purring anchor in the often turbulent seas of her 20s. The simmering tension in her life was this unresolved grief, a wound that had scabbed over but never truly healed. She yearned for connection, but was terrified of further loss. The photograph, that impossible image of Jasper, wasn't just a disruption. It was an earthquake, threatening to shatter the fragile defenses she'd spent 3 years constructing. It whispered of a hope so audacious it felt like a cruelty, yet so compelling. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she couldn't ignore it. The status quo of her carefully managed sorrow was about to be irrevocably broken. The photograph became Emma's obsession. For the next 48 hours, sleep was a forgotten luxury. She pinned Jasper's old pictures, kitten photos, regal poses on the back of the sofa, him batting at a sunbeam, alongside the enlarged printout of IMG 7834, the distinctive coffee-stained blotch over the left eye, the unique thumbprint smudge on the right hind leg. They were undeniably identical. It wasn't just similar, it was him. The way he held his tail, the slight tilt of his head as he looked toward something out of frame in the Dune photo. These were Jasper's mannerisms etched into her memory. Her initial wave of shock slowly gave way to a frantic, meticulous investigation of the digital file. The metadata was intact. The photo was taken with her Canon 5D Mark III, the date stamp, reading June 17, 2022, at 6:52 p.m. This aligned with her hazy recollection of the West Coast drift trip. The GPS coordinates, however, were frustratingly vague. A general marker for a 10-mile stretch of the Oregon coastline, an area known for its rugged, undeveloped beaches and state parks. There was no precise pinpoint. A fragile, terrifying hope began to bloom in the desolate landscape of her heart. It was a terrifying sensation, making her feel more vulnerable than she had in years. What if it was just a cruel coincidence, a feline doppelganger? But the specificity of the markings, two of them in precisely the same spots, it felt too improbable. Doubt warred with an almost desperate yearning. She had to know. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. She pulled out a suitcase, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of morning light, piercing her blinds. Her initial goal formed with a sudden sharp clarity: go to Oregon. Pinpoint the exact location where IMG 7834 was taken. And then the part that made her stomach clench with a mixture of hope and dread. Find out if that cat Jasper's ghost or Jasper himself was still there, or if anyone in that remote coastal area knew of him. Her first call was to Sarah. "You're going to think I'm insane." Emma began, her voice trembling. She explained about the photo, the markings, the impossible hope. Sarah listened patiently, her initial silence giving way to gentle questions. "Are you sure, Em, after all this time?" But she heard the conviction in Emma's voice, the raw need that transcended logic. "Okay," Sarah said finally. "Okay, go. But promise me you'll take care of yourself and call me every day." Packing was a surreal experience. Alongside practical clothes and her camera gear, she tucked in a small sealed plastic bag containing a few of Jasper's shed whiskers she'd found in a book long ago, and his favorite battered mouse toy. Its catnip scent, long faded. The weight of these small mementos was immense, each one a testament to the love she'd thought buried. The drive to O'Hare, the flight to Portland, the rental car journey toward the coast, it all passed in a blur of anxious anticipation. She was chasing a ghost, a digital echo, on the slimmest of chances, heading towards a confrontation with either profound joy or devastating final confirmation of her loss. The Oregon air, when she finally stepped out of the car near the coast, smelled of salt pine and an overwhelming sense of the unknown. Emma arrived in the coastal region indicated by the photo's vague geotag, a sprawling area of small scattered towns, dense forests, and dramatic wind-swept coastline. The landscape from IMG 7834 was everywhere and nowhere. Countless stretches of dunes and seagrass looked maddeningly similar. She started her search systematically, driving slowly along coastal roads, her printed photo in hand, stopping at every gas station, local diner, and bait shop. The responses were invariably polite but unhelpful. "Lots of cats around here, lady. A grizzled fisherman told her his eyes kind but dismissive. Wild ones farm cats, they come and go. Some offered pitying looks, clearly thinking her on a fool's errand, chasing a memory. The first major complication was the sheer scale of the area and the lack of distinct landmarks in her photograph. The dunes, the seagrass, the distant ocean. It was a beautiful but repetitive canvas. She spent hours walking beaches, her boots sinking into the soft sand, scanning the landscape until her eyes ached, trying to match the specific curvature of a dune or the grouping of certain plants to her reference image. The second complication, a gnawing, persistent fear, was time. 3 years had passed since the photo was taken. For a cat, especially one potentially living wild, that was a significant span. The odds were stacked against her, days blurred into a frustrating cycle of searching, questioning, and dwindling hope. She found herself drawn to the quieter, less populated stretches of coastline, wondering if Jasper, if it was him, would have sought refuge away from people. It was during one of these more desolate explorations, after a particularly disheartening morning, that she decided to visit the county animal shelter, a low-slung building tucked away off the main highway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and the faint sounds of barking and meowing. She met David, the shelter manager, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a weary but compassionate demeanor. He listened to Emma's story patiently, examining the photos of Jasper and the dune image without interruption. Emma braced herself for skepticism, but David surprised her. "Those are some mighty specific markings," he said, rubbing his chin. "Can't say I recall a cat like that coming through here, not recently, but it's a big coastline. Animals get lost, show up in strange places." He couldn't offer any immediate leads on Jasper, but he gave her a list of local lost and found pet websites, community Facebook groups dedicated to the coastal towns, and crucially, the names and numbers of a few longtime animal rescue volunteers who lived in the more remote communities, people who often knew the local animal populations better than anyone. Following David's advice, Emma began the painstaking process of posting Jasper's photo and her story online and calling the volunteers. Most calls led to dead ends. But then one evening, she reached Martha, an elderly woman with a crackly but kind voice who lived in a small cabin nestled in the dunes about 15 miles south of where Emma had been concentrating her search. Emma emailed her the photos. "Well, now that patch over the eye does ring a faint bell, dear," Martha said slowly after a while. "Some years back, maybe 2-3 years ago, there were reports of a white cat with unusual brown spots being seen near the old Miller property. That's a protected snowy plover nesting site now, so access is restricted. Folks aren't supposed to go tromping around there. Maybe that's why no one's seen it much." She couldn't offer any recent sightings, but it was the first flicker of a concrete lead. Emma spent the next 3 days exploring the periphery of the Miller property, a vast wind-swept area of protected dunes. She respected the nesting site boundaries, using binoculars, calling Jasper's name softly against the wind. She found no sign of him. The initial spark of hope Martha had ignited began to dim. The emotional toll of the constant searching, the dashed hopes, was immense. Exhausted and disheartened, she sat in her cheap motel room, the Oregon drizzle mirroring the gloom in her heart. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe this whole trip was a mistake, a desperate delusion. Just as she was drafting a text to Sarah admitting defeat, Her phone pinged with an alert from one of the Facebook groups David had recommended. A new post, not about Jasper, but it prompted her to idly scroll back through the group's history, an act of pure, tired procrastination. Emma was about to close the laptop, the cursor blinking over the booking confirmation for a flight back to Chicago. Dejection sat heavy in her chest. She'd given it her best shot, chased a ghost across the country, and found nothing but the vast indifference of the Oregon coast. As a final, almost subconscious act of avoidance, she clicked on one of the local community Facebook pages David had mentioned, idly scrolling back through its feed years into the past. Post after post of lost dogs, found bikes, bake sale announcements. Her eyes were glazing over when a blurry, poorly lit photo snagged her attention. The post was dated October 12th, 2022, 2.5 years ago. Approximately 4 months after Emma had taken her photograph on the dunes. The photo showed a white cat partially obscured by a bush, but clearly visible was a dark circular patch over its left eye. The caption, typed in simple, unadorned text, read, "Found this fella hanging around my woodshed last few weeks. Looks lost. Anyone missing a white cat with brown spots? Near Alder Creek Road." It was posted by a woman named Agnes Peterson. Alder Creek Road. Emma quickly typed it into her map application. It was about 20 miles inland from the coastal area she'd been meticulously combing, nestled in a more densely wooded region bordering a state forest. A jolt, electric and fierce, shot through Emma. This was it. This wasn't just a look-alike. This was photographic evidence of a cat with Jasper's unique marking alive after her own photo was taken and in a different specific location. The vague hope she'd been clinging to suddenly sharpened into something tangible, something fiercely urgent. The cat had been seen documented by someone else. Her initial search had been too focused on the coast, on the exact spot of her photograph. What if Jasper, if it was him, had moved inland, perhaps seeking more consistent shelter or food away from the exposed coastline? The world outside her motel room window, previously a landscape of defeat, now seemed charged with possibility. She slammed the laptop shut, the flight confirmation disappearing from the screen. There was no way she was leaving Oregon now. Not yet. This was the point of no return. Her initial, somewhat nebulous goal of finding a cat from a photo had transformed. Now her mission was clear and specific. Find Agnes Peterson. Find out what she knew about the cat she called Fella. Find out what happened to him. Emma's role shifted instantly. She was no longer just a grieving pet owner on a sentimental journey. She was an investigator following a solid lead. The exhaustion she'd felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The scope of the mystery hadn't just deepened. It had taken a sharp, unexpected turn. How had a cat possibly heard Jasper travel 20 miles inland from the coast? Had he been alone, injured? The questions multiplied, but now they were fueled by a concrete direction, a name, and a new, more rugged landscape to explore. The quiet desperation that had accompanied her coastal search was now overlaid with a determined, almost predatory focus. She had to find Agnes, and she had to do it now. Tracking down Agnes Peterson proved easier than Emma had anticipated. Her Facebook profile was sparse, but it listed her town, a small, unincorporated community near the state forest. A quick search of online public records provided a likely address on Alder Creek Road. Emma felt a tremor of nervous energy as she drove inland the next morning. leaving the misty coastline behind for the denser, shadier realm of Oregon's coastal range forests. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and cedar. Agnes Peterson lived in a modest older house set back from the road, surrounded by a rambling garden and towering fir trees. An elderly woman with keen, observant eyes and a cloud of white hair answered the door, wiping her hands on an apron. Emma, clutching prints of both her Dune photo and Agnes's Facebook post, explained her story, her voice earnest and a little breathless. Agnes listened intently, her expression unreadable at first. Then she nodded slowly. "Patches," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "That's what I called him because of his spots. Yes, I remember him well." She invited Emma inside into a cozy kitchen filled with the aroma of baking bread over cups of tea. Agnes recounted her experience with Patches. He had appeared suddenly in the late summer of 2022, wild and incredibly wary, skinny as a rake and limping poor thing. Agnes recalled her brow furrowing with sympathy, had a nasty limp in his right front leg. Emma's heart clenched. The accident, Jasper's carrier. Could he have been injured then and somehow made his way this far? Agnes confirmed the markings from Emma's photos of Jasper. That's him, no doubt about it. That peculiar spot over his eye like a little bandit. Agnes explained that she'd left food out for Patches, and over several months he'd become slightly less skittish, though he never allowed her to get close. He'd use her old woodshed for shelter sometimes, especially when the autumn rains began. He was a survivor, she said with an almost palpable air of resilience. Then in the early spring of the following year, he'd simply vanished. I figured he'd moved on, or maybe, well, life's hard for a stray out here, Agnes said softly. She mentioned that he often seemed to come and go from the direction of an old abandoned farmstead that bordered the eastern edge of her property, a place with a dilapidated barn and overgrown fields. Used to see him slinking off towards that old barn at dusk sometimes. She mused Emma's hope, so recently reignited, was now a complex mix of elation and gnawing fear. Jasper had been alive here. He'd been injured, but had survived for months. But where was he now? Had he succumbed to his injury or the wilderness after leaving Agnes's care? The abandoned barn became her new focal point. Agnes gave her directions, along with a kindly warning to be careful. Place has been empty for years, probably full of critters. Emma drove to the nearest town with a hardware store. Her new plan required resources. She bought several cans of high-quality cat food, a pair of sturdy work gloves, a powerful flashlight, and after a moment's hesitation and a quick call to David at the shelter for advice, a humane live trap, a last resort, but one she felt she needed to have. She also retrieved her best telephoto lens from her camera bag. She would need patience, observation, and a bit of luck. The abandoned farmstead was eerie and silent. The barn, a listing gray structure against the backdrop of the dense forest. Emma spent the first afternoon just observing from a distance, hidden in a thicket of ferns. She set out a small dish of food and water near the barn's crumbling foundation, her heart thudding with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. Days began to fall into a new rhythm arrive before dawn. Watch, listen, replenish the food, leave before dark. The solitude was immense, broken only by the sounds of the forest. Self-doubt was a constant companion. Was she chasing a ghost again this time, based on a 2.5-year-old sighting from Agnes? Was this just another dead end in her increasingly desperate quest? After 3 days of fruitless observation at the abandoned farmstead, Emma was beginning to feel the familiar creep of despair. The food she left out disappeared each night, but the culprits revealed by the dew-kissed grass in the morning were clearly raccoons, and perhaps a bold opossum, their tracks distinct in the soft earth. Then on the fourth morning, as the sun was just beginning to pierce through the thick canopy, she saw it, a flash of white streaking from the edge of the woods and disappearing into a gaping hole in the barn's foundation. It was too fast, too fleeting to identify with certainty, but her heart leaped into her throat. It wasn't a raccoon. This sighting, however brief, galvanized her. She became more systematic. David from the county shelter kindly lent her a motion-activated trail camera. Emma mounted it carefully camouflaged amongst the overgrown weeds, its lens focused on the food bowl. Each morning, retrieving the SD card was a ritual filled with breathless anticipation. The first few days yielded grainy images of the usual nocturnal visitors. But then one morning, scrolling through the previous night's captures, she stopped. There, illuminated by the camera's infrared flash, was a cat, white, with darker markings clearly visible on its head and flank drinking from the water bowl. She'd left. The image was blurry, the angle not perfect, but the pattern of the cafe au lait splotch over its eye seemed undeniably, achingly familiar. It had to be him. She knew she needed to get closer to see him with her own eyes in the daylight. The trail camera confirmed his presence, but not his identity. Beyond all doubt, she began spending entire days hidden in a makeshift blind she constructed from fallen branches and camouflage netting, enduring biting insects, the damp chill of early mornings, and the stiffening ache in her limbs from remaining still for hours. The emotional strain was immense. She was running on fumes fueled by adrenaline, dwindling savings, and the potent, terrifying cocktail of hope and fear. Her calls with Sarah became shorter, her voice strained, just as her resolve was beginning to fray. A fierce early autumn storm blew in from the coast, lashing the forest with wind and torrential rain. For 2 solid days, Emma was forced to retreat to her motel room, the drumming of rain on the roof a dismal counterpoint to the storm in her heart. This felt like the end. If Jasper, or the cat she desperately hoped was Jasper, was indeed out there, he would have sought deeper, more secure shelter. He could be miles away by now, or worse. She imagined him cold, hungry, alone, the full weight of her grief, not just for Jasper, but for the life she'd lost, the dreams that had died with him pressed down on her. She wept for the first time since arriving in Oregon, deep, racking sobs of despair and exhaustion. This quest, she thought, was truly impossible. A fool's errand, born of unresolved sorrow. The storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, leaving the world rain-washed and smelling of pine and wet earth. Emma, feeling hollowed out but strangely calm, knew she had to go back to the barn one last time. If there was no sign she would leave, she owed herself that closure. As she approached the dilapidated structure, the air was still the forest, unnervingly quiet. And then she saw them small, distinct paw prints in the freshly softened mud leading to and from the food bowl. It had been used, and recently her breath hitched. With a renewed, almost grim determination, she settled into her blind, her camera, ready. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Just as the light began to fail, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, she saw him. He emerged silently from the dark interior of the barn, bold as brass in the fading light, and hopped onto a rotted fence post. He sat calmly, grooming a white paw. White fur a little, weathered a little, matted in places, and then he turned his head. There, unmistakable even in the twilight, was the perfect coffee-stained patch over his left eye. And as he stretched a hind leg to groom, she saw the familiar smudge on his flank. Older, thinner than she remembered, and with a definite air of the wild about him. But it was undeniably, impossibly Jasper. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden stillness of the evening. She forced herself to remain calm, to breathe. Slowly, cautiously, she rose from her hiding spot, her movements measured, trying not to make any sudden noises that might startle him. Jasper stopped grooming his head, snapping up ears, swiveling like tiny radar dishes. He watched her, his gaze unnervingly intelligent, unblinking. He didn't bolt. He simply observed her, a wild thing, assessing a potential threat, or perhaps something else entirely. She took a few tentative steps closer, then sank to the damp ground about 20 feet away from the fence post. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and decaying leaves. "Jasper?" She whispered, her voice barely audible, cracking with emotion. "Is that you, boy?" The cat's ears twitched at the sound of his name. He made a low, hesitant trill in his throat, a sound so distinctively Jasper, a sound she hadn't heard in 3 agonizing years, that it felt like a physical blow stealing her breath and bringing tears stinging to her eyes. He remained on the fence post, poised, cautious. With trembling fingers, Emma reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the battered feather wand, its once bright blue feathers now faded and chewed. It was his favorite toy one. She'd inexplicably packed a talisman against despair. She held it out, her hand shaking, and gave it the slightest twitch, the way she always had. Jasper's golden eyes, so like the ones that stared back at her from countless old photographs fixed on the wand. He stared at it for a long, charged moment. Then his gaze flicked back to her face, then to the wand again. The silence stretched taut and fragile. Then, with a fluid grace that belied his slightly weathered appearance, he hopped off the fence post, landing silently on the soft earth. He took a few cautious steps towards her, then paused, one paw lifted, testing the air. Emma held her breath, not daring to move, not daring to hope too much. She could see the slight, almost imperceptible unevenness in his gait as he moved, a lingering trace of the limp Agnes had described. He came closer, inch by cautious inch, until he was just a few feet away. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching, then took another step and another, until he was right before her outstretched, trembling hand. He sniffed her fingers, a long, slow inhalation. Emma's world narrowed to this single, heart-stopping moment, and then the miracle. He bumped his head hard against her knuckles, then rubbed the side of his face against her hand, a deep, rumbling purr erupting from his chest like a tiny, contented motor. It was his signature greeting, the one reserved for her alone, the gesture she had longed for, dreamed of, despaired of ever feeling again. "Oh, Jasper!" She choked out tears, streaming freely down her face, now unchecked. "It is you." She reached out her other hand, slowly and gently stroked his fur. It was a little rougher than she remembered, but beneath it, he was solid, warm, undeniably real. He leaned into her touch, purring louder, the sound a balm to her shattered soul. The reunion was quiet, almost reverent under the vast, indifferent Oregon sky that had, against all odds, borne witness to their impossible coming together. The journey back to a semblance of normalcy began with a visit to a vet in the nearest coastal town. Jasper, cradled in a carrier Emma had rushed to buy, was remarkably healthy for a cat who had clearly spent years fending for himself. He was underweight, his fur a little dull, but his eyes were bright. The vet found evidence of an old, poorly healed fracture in his right foreleg, a permanent reminder of the highway accident, and to Emma's profound relief, located his microchip. A quick scan, a call to the registry, and the unbelievable was confirmed. This was without a shadow of a doubt Jasper, her lost boy. The vet, a kind woman with a soft spot for strays, marveled at his resilience, calling him one tough little wanderer. That evening in her motel room, Emma made the call she never thought she'd make, updating Jasper's microchip details with her current address. The simple administrative task felt monumental, a definitive closing of a painful chapter and the opening of an entirely new one. What she had found wasn't just a cat in a photo. She had found a piece of her own lost self. Jasper's impossible journey of survival, from a traumatic accident across unknown miles through harsh seasons, somehow finding his way to a place where a random photograph and a series of improbable connections could lead her back to him, felt like a miracle. Not a supernatural one, but a miracle of pure, unadulterated feline tenacity, and the enduring invisible thread of the bond they shared. She later learned from Agnes, and then from David at the shelter, that the area around the abandoned barn had, for a brief time around, when Jasper might have arrived there, been an informal release point for a trap-neuter return TNR program for feral cats. It was possible that kind volunteers, noticing an injured newcomer, had left out food, providing him with just enough support to survive those initial critical months before Agnes herself had started feeding him more regularly. He had likely never been fully trapped or returned due to his wariness, but the peripheral kindness of strangers may have played a crucial role. The drive back to Chicago was a world away from her desperate flight to Oregon. Jasper, older perhaps, a little wilder in spirit, but still her affectionate boy, mostly slept in his carrier, occasionally letting out a soft meow, as if to reassure her he was still there. Emma felt a lightness, a sense of peace that had been absent for 3 long years. The world, once shaded in hues of grief, now seemed brighter, imbued with a renewed sense of wonder. Back in her Chicago apartment, Jasper settled in with surprising ease, though he now spent long hours at the window, gazing out at the bustling city with a new contemplative wisdom. In his golden eyes, Emma's photography began to change too. The sterile architectural lines gave way to softer subjects. She started a new personal project, a series she tentatively titled The Survivors. Portraits and stories of rescued animals, each a testament to the improbable odds they had overcome. Her passion, dormant for so long, was rekindled, her lens now focused on resilience and hope. The photograph IMG 7834 was printed, framed, and given pride of place on her desk. It was no longer a symbol of haunting loss, but a reminder of an unbelievable journey of unwavering hope against all reason, and of a quiet, persistent love that had, in its own extraordinary and perfectly natural way, transcended the seemingly insurmountable barriers of time and distance, changing everything.